This LOS is described securities issued by non-sovereign governments, quasi-government entities, and supranational agencies. Non-sovereign government, quasi-government, and supranational bonds. So first we'll look at non-sovereign bonds. Levels of government below the national level, such as provinces in Canada, regions, states in the United States, for example, and cities issue bonds called non-sovereign government bonds or non-sovereign bonds. So they're levels of government, but not at the top level, okay? The next is quasi-government bonds, and national governments establish organizations that perform various functions for them. These organizations often have both public and private sector characteristics, but they are not actual government entities. They are referred to as quasi-government entities, although they take different names in different countries. Supranational bonds. A form of often highly rated bonds is issued by supranational agencies, also referred to as multilateral agencies. The most well-known supranational agencies are the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, the European Investment Bank, EIB, the Asian Development Bank, ADB, and the African Development Bank, AFDB. Bonds issued by supranational agencies are called supranational bonds. We'll do a quick practice question here. The type of bond issued by a multilateral agency, such as the International Monetary Fund, IMF, is best described as A, sovereign bond, B, supranational bond, or C, quasi-government bond. I think that question is so easy, and as you know on the CFA exam, there'll be some questions that are easy. There's a range from easy to medium to hard, okay? So that's why sometimes it's nice to just put in an easy one. B is correct. The IMF is a multilateral agency, and they issue supranational bonds. A and C are incorrect because sovereign bonds and quasi-government bonds are issued by national governments and by entities that perform various functions for national governments respectively. Another quick practice question. Relative to sovereign bonds, non-sovereign bonds with similar characteristics most likely trade at a yield that is A, lower, B, the same, or C, higher. Again, I think that should be a pretty easy question. C is correct. Non-sovereign bonds usually trade at a higher yield and lower price than sovereign bonds with similar characteristics. The higher yield is because of the higher credit risk associated with non-sovereign issuers relative to sovereign issuers, although default rates of local governments are historically low and their credit quality is usually high. The higher yield may also be a consequence of non-sovereign bonds being less liquid than sovereign bonds with similar characteristics. Now this question is not exactly in the text in this section, but because we're talking about yields and different types of bonds, I thought I'd put it in just as a nice to know, maybe not a need to know. Nevertheless, I think it's a good question to have a look at, and I think it fits in here fairly nicely. So a U.S. investor has purchased a tax-exempt 5-year municipal bond at a yield of 3.86%, which is 100 basis points less than the yield on a 5-year option-free U.S. Treasury. If the investor's marginal tax rate is 32%, then the yield ratio are closest to A, 0.79, B, 1.26, or C, 5.68. Okay, it's not too difficult when you see the solution, and this is something that's maybe nice to know and perhaps need to know. So the yield ratio is the yield on the tax-exempt bond divided by the yield of the U.S. Treasury. So we saw the yield on the tax-exempt bond is 3.86%, and it was 100 basis points less. So therefore, the yield on the 5-year option-free U.S. Treasury would be 4.86, the 3.86 plus the 100 basis points, 100 basis points being 1%. So 3.86 divided by 4.86 equals 0.79. So nice to know, nothing difficult, and this is, you know, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. Once you've seen it, fairly easy calculation, but if you've never seen it before, you're not going to get it, you know, potentially not going to get it right. Anyhow, nice little question to have And one last question to finish on, and again, it's a little bit of a calculation. Just thought I'd slip this in at the same point here just to end it. An investor is considering the purchase of two bonds. One is a 5% coupon tax-exempt bond that yields 4.5%, while the other is a 7% coupon bond that is taxable and yields 6%. If the two bonds are alike in all other characteristics, the marginal tax rate that would make the investor indifferent between the two bonds is closest to A, 25%, B, 28.6%, or C, 33.3%. Again, this is one of these questions where once you've seen the solution once, you can see it's not that difficult. So the indifference point would be the tax rate that satisfies the equation 6% times 1 minus t equals 4.5%. Because the 5% coupon tax exempt is a bond that yields 4.5%, and the other is it's taxable and it yields 6%. So 6% times 1 minus the tax rate equals 4.5%. So solving for t, the marginal tax rate equals 25%. And the challenge here is, as I said, is to know the formula and what the inputs are. Anyhow, that's the last slide for this LOS. Thank you.